But Bridgeport is fascinating in the progressive era for how really reform-minded it was. So John T. King, even though he is a Republican Party boss, so to speak, and Clifford Wilson, who's mayor from like 1910 to through the World War I period, is his protege. He himself is Irish Catholic. You wouldn't expect that to be someone who's a Republican, but in Connecticut things are very funny. It's the Democrats, both in the city of Bridgeport and in the state, that are so heavily dominated by Irish Democrats that they don't allow other ethnics in, which is why they're not really the party of the New Deal in the 1930s. It's the Socialist Party and Jasper McLevy that is representing that New Deal thrust. And so for reasons that I'm not able to actually figure out, John T. King is early on Irish Catholic Republican. Not unknown, but certainly not usual for the state. So, but he has a grand vision, and he has very productive relationships with local businessmen. DeVere Warner from Warner Corset Company is an early ally, and a number of people around Warner are also part of this mix. What they do is, well, first of all, donating parks, starting with, of course, P.T. Barnum in the 1880s. But then, in the progressive era, which nationally, from the end of the Depression of the 1890s, it was about 1897, up to the beginning of World War I, officially 1914, with the European entry. That's called the progressive era. And it's called that because nationally, there are all these initiatives for reform. Reform from the predatory monopoly capitalism that had dominated the latter part of the 19th century, leading to the biggest crash that had ever been experienced, which is the great crash in the mid-1890s. So that crash is overcome, and you enter the big era of corporations, national corporations. But people are also, business leaders as well as intellectuals, are very worried about what this depression of the 1890s has meant. And what it means is that some of the more far-thinking are saying, well, maybe we need to create some limits or some regulation on this free market. Otherwise, it's just going to keep spinning out of control every 20 years, which is what the cycle had been throughout the 19th century. Boom and bust. We can't do that anymore. Even our businesses are threatened. And monopoly isn't the answer. It's already been outlawed by the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1892. So we have to come up with another corporate model. And so business leaders are interested in reform. And some of them, they're civic-minded as well. In Bridgeport, you have a really interesting expansion of the park system. You have, singularly in this state, you have a public library system that is very expansive. I think the Bishop Room was established at this time, with an incredible array of research materials gathered, because there's no private historical association like there are in some other big cities like New Haven or Hartford. So this becomes the place. You also have a very good education system, such as it is, particularly Alfred Phones, who is the city superintendent of health. He establishes dental clinics in every school. I mean, that's where we come to have the UB Phones School of Dentistry. Phones is one of those people who needs to have more written about him, because he in fact is a pioneer, and Bridgeport is the city that implements that. The idea that you needed not only health clinics in the schools to service the large numbers of immigrant children that are coming, but that you need dental clinics too, as well as other health services. And what King does is then include city officials and city businessmen, elites, in that kind of project to improve the city, to make it the industrial capital of Connecticut. What also happens at the end of this period, the beginning of the war, is that Bridgeport becomes a war-boom town. It is the provider in 1915-16, before the U.S. enters the war, and changes everything pretty radically. But in these first couple of years of the war over there, Bridgeport provides 2/3 of all the small arms and ammunition that go to the European combatants. There's even a German ammunition factory here. The Remington Arms, which had a Union Metallic cartridge company that made bullets and other projectiles, builds this great Russian rifle factory, it was called. It was recently torn down. It's what you know of as the old GE plant, which GE bought it in 1921. But during the war, it was a bustling producer of guns for the Russian Tsar's army, guns and bayonets, and of course cartridges from the UMC division. That is in fact what was in the hold of the Lusitania. It was not the German torpedo that actually sunk the ship, but rather it was a secondary explosion that was from all of the boxes of UMC cartridges that were just unearthed about 10 years ago or so, when the Lusitania, maybe 20 years now, when the Lusitania was actually discovered on the floor of the ocean and was investigated. What do you have? You've got boxes of UMC cartridges. And that's what blew up. And that's what finally blew up the ship. And so Bridgeport is under almost every one of the stories of the war years. And so Bridgeport almost doubles in size during the time. It started in 1910, the population was only about 102,000. By 1920, it settled into about 145,000, and it's more or less stayed the same since. But during the war years, it's estimated that at least 190 people were living in the city, because people were coming in from everywhere in order to work in these factories. So you had Union Metallic cartridge, you had Remington Arms, the rifle factory, Bullard's produces cannons, and they expand their plant. Everything you can imagine, and even more, of ammunition plants were actually built here or expanded here. And that continues all the way through 1918. What it also meant, of course, was that in the great struggles between AFL craft unions and manufacturers at this time, the war gave manufacturers the opportunity to improve their productivity by instituting scientific management, or Taylorism, which is probably not something anyone talks about anymore, but because it really fell out of favor in the 1970s. But that becomes the way in which most mass production is actually constructed during most of the 20th century. And it's minute subdivision of the task at hand, creating machinery that needed to be operated. Nothing's automatic, but it needs to be operated by an unskilled or semi-skilled operator, not by the machinists or the others who had attained craft status. And that, of course, is cheaper and more efficient for manufacturers. It's it's absolute deadening for craft workers. So you get a lot of strikes, certainly in summer 1915, first led by, well, the building trades who were building the rifle factory, and also then followed by the machinists who were about to work in that factory. What happens, though, that spring of 1915, by May, everything settles down. August 2nd, the corset workers at Warner Brothers walks out, demanding an 8-hour day and a union contract. And suddenly everybody, according to the newspapers, everybody's going on strike. for exactly the same thing, the 8-hour day. Now, that's a 48-hour work week because Saturday is a full working day. But still, that's a lot better than the 60 hours or so, 55 to 60 hours. That was the average work week for anyone working in industry. And that is what gains Bridgeport national attention. It's interesting that that's the culmination of this progressive era and the new form techniques would lead to this kind of mass uprising of labor to demand that our quality of living had to go up. You had progressive era reformers like Warner or like other leaders of industries in town who were quite happy to be part of the reform efforts if it meant giving charity or setting up institutions that would help the people, or libraries for their edification, or dental clinics or whatever in the schools. But when it came down to management, nah, they didn't want anything to do with that, and that led to a lot of clashes throughout the next 4 years of the war, and that's my chapter 1 of my study of the rise of Jasper McLevy, who is not well known or outspoken during the World War I years, oddly, because he's actually an up-and-coming politician and community leader, and he's a labor leader. But the story goes from some of the literature and letters I've been able to unearth that he had a brother who he was very close to who died early in the war, and he was just apparently devastated by that. Also, the Socialist Party was attacked by the Justice Department for being unpatriotic, and so the Socialist Party is pretty much destroyed during World War I, and only a very handful of socialists in Bridgeport kind of keep themselves together and rebuild in the 20s. And it's hard to know which is the reason for the Jasper McLevy not showing up in any newspapers during the war years.